All right, my guest today is my longtime old friend, Dr. Bruce Hood, award-winning professor of developmental psychology at Bristol University and the author of several books, including SuperSense, The Self-Illusion, The Domesticated Brain, and Possessed. His course, The Science of Happiness, is the most popular course at Bristol University. He's appeared extensively on TV and radio, including co-hosting the BBC podcast, The Happiness Half Hour. You only need a half an hour for happiness. He's a fellow of the American Psychological Society, the Royal Institution of Great Britain, and the British Psychological Society. Here's his new book, The Science of Happiness. 7 Lessons for Living Well. All right, we will go through all 7 of them. In the meantime, Bruce, nice to see you. It's been a long time.
It's great to see you, Mike. I always love chatting with you. It's always a lot of fun. I always learn so much.
I was looking through my old pictures because the last time we were together, I think in Bristol, it must have been 15 years ago or so.
My goodness, yes. Of course, that was a visit to that zoo where the crazy owner was he was a creationist, wasn't he? So he had these amazing animals. And alongside all the displays, he had these billboards with kind of his theory that the world was only 10,000 years old.
Right. Yeah, it was so funny.
I was just going to say, the zoo's still going, but he's taken down all the signs. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yes. I do think the theistic evolutionists have kind of won the game there. Like, okay, let's concede that evolution is true. This was God's way of doing it, and let's move on to something else.
Goodness, yes.
I mean, really, the whole God stuff and creationism, that's so old hat now. I mean, we almost never deal with that anymore.
We've evolved.
Very good. That's nice. We also visited Dick Gregory, the late Dick Gregory. He was one of your mentors, I think.
Yeah, I used to have coffee with him at 3:00 on a Thursday every week. And I would just bask in his incredible stories. He was taught by Wittgenstein and he knew all the greats. And it was just like connecting with the past. It was just a fantastic opportunity.
I do wonder, when you and I get up there in our 80s and 90s, if the young grad students are going, what was it like when you knew back in the 80s? Like, am I really that old?
They've changed. They're not interested anymore. They've become very Machiavellian. They just kind of want their degrees and out the door, I'm afraid. Not entirely. Right. There's a few good ones. But
Well, so we can get into that because maybe that's not the best pathway toward happiness. But so just kind of since you've been in the business a long time, let's go over a little review of the history of psychology. Why do we need a happiness book now? Why is positive psychology such a great thing?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's not like there's a shortage of them. Trying to publish this book has actually been quite challenging because it's just a saturated field. But I think the problem is that a lot of the books there are, basically saying more or less the same thing. They're written by people who haven't really got a full understanding of some of the really interesting, to my mind, scientific explanations for why these things work, if they do work. And I think we can go over the ground on that quite a bit because I think there's a lot of kind of snake oil out there. So I think that this book I felt was timely because, there is an epidemic of unhappiness. I mean, some people question whether that's just a reporting bias or it's just this generation. But I think we can say with some degree of certainty that the data is quite clear now that the younger kind of 18 to 24 generation, in the UK at least, it's now 1 in 3 are reporting depression and anxiety compared to 1 in 4 20 years ago. So something has happened over the last 20 years. Now, that's, I'm sure there's lots of opinions on that. I don't know if you've been following Jonathan Haidt's work on Yeah, so he really, he targets Instagram as being the major culprit. I try not to get into that argument too much. It sort of gets bogged down in terms of the data files. But I generally support his position. I think he's right. There's something about social comparison which is being accelerated by technology, and I think that's at the core of a lot of the misery and disaffection. But so there's a lot of books out there, and I felt that this one, I thought there was a unifying theme which really built upon the self-illusion, which was one of my books. Namely that those practices which seem to work seem to sort of alter your sense of self, or at least they turn your attention away from a very inwardly egocentric, ruminating kind of person to either directly, putting your efforts into the well-being of others, or turning that attention of spotlight of your consciousness away from the internal dialogue you have in your head through meditation or hobbies or anything which really captures those moments of flow, when you've been absorbed. So I kind of, I put together an account over 7 lessons, I've called them, which explains first why the self is an illusion, is constructed. It's primarily egocentric. Kids are just born like this. We're all like this. It's the perspective from which consciousness works, which is from the first person perspective. But that as we develop over childhood, we have to learn to become less egocentric. Otherwise, we'll be kind of ignored or ostracized. And then I developed this into the kind of the emotional dependency that we have. And then the remaining chapters, I mean, if you want me to go through them, but they're basically building on the fact that brains are kind of optimized to look out for problems. Because it's much more important to identify your problem and solve them rather than, languishing in the status quo or just focusing on good things. So we're kind of, in a sense, biased towards negative information. And then, of course, we're surrounded in the media. And so there's a chapter about becoming more optimistic, which is recognizing this as a problem, but then taking your problems and then reconfiguring them in a way or approaching them in a way which is a much more positive way of doing it. And then I get into the attentional spotlight, which is this aspect of consciousness, which is, I think, very interesting from a neuroscience perspective, that you're only ever really aware of what you're attending to. But that attention can be hijacked. For example, if you're not focusing on a task, your mind tends to wander. And very often it's wandering to those unresolved problems that your brain is kind of trying to sort out. Then I get into talking about social connection, which is one of the strongest interventions. Something many of us avoid because it just seems so awkward, but that's actually misplaced. And then finally, I talk about getting out of your head, where I disclose some of my past experiences with psychedelics, but I draw attention to the fact that there appears to be a renaissance going on in terms of clinically assisted psychedelic therapies being useful in depression. And if you're not into psychedelics, there are other ways you can alter your sense of self. I talk about the experience that astronauts have when they go up into space. One of the most profound emotional experiences that they report is the overview effect, which is this sudden realization of just how small their problems are and how vast the universe is. And when you're looking back at the Earth, you suddenly feel this profound, overwhelming sense of humanity. So that's the sort of 7 lessons, which is sort of talking about our origins, our beginnings from childhood and as a species, developing into this technological animal that unfortunately is spending more time worrying about their problems because the technology is freeing us up. In the past, we were kind of more concerned about just living from day to day, but now we've got the freedom of choice, and that's unfortunate.
Mm-hmm. A good problem to have.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have been following the debate. A lot of my podcast guests talk about this. I have Abigail Schreier coming on next week. Her book is Bad Therapy, and she puts the blame more on kind of coddling parenting, teachers that have bought into the whole psychological victimization. Everybody has a problem of some kind.
Yeah.
To the point where if you don't have some kind of disorder, you're weird. Where every student has some kind. Yeah, her stats, I think, were in America, I think it was 42% of American kids have some kind of officially diagnosed mental problem.
Yeah. Yeah. We've got the same figure in the higher education as well. So part of it's kind of playing the game a bit, because if you get disability statementing in higher education, you can get extra time to do things. So I do worry a little bit about that. And you're absolutely right. There's just a complete profusion of diagnoses. Neurodiverse. I really hate that term, neurodiversity.
You do?
Oh, it just annoys the hell out of me. I actually discovered a colleague of mine, a lecturer. Yes, I discovered he's had himself statemented too. So he's now got neurodiversity as well. And it's almost, I think it's the way of getting himself out of trouble, because he's well known for speaking his own mind at times. So yeah, I mean, we're all neurodiverse. It loses its value. And I think that's the problem, because there are people clearly who have challenging conditions. But if you dilute the category so much, then it ceases to, be of value as a clinical diagnosis. So I kind of worry about the way it's, just seems to be getting worse.
I think that the emphasis on that term, though, is to get away from the stigmatization of things like autism. Oh, he's autism. He's broken. Well, Elon Musk is autistic or whatever, and look what he can do. So it's just neurodiversity. Well, Pinker calls this the euphemistic treadmill, right? So eventually neurodiversity will be a pejorative, and we'll have to come up with something new.
Oh, I know, yeah. But you are right. I mean, this whole kind of, that's the other thing that, as I've been speaking about the book, it's really, I've been talking to people about it, and I think we share this opinion that there's one of the problems I've seen in the kind of self-help industry Is this mantra that you've got to put your own oxygen mask on first and look after yourself first and prioritize yourself first. And like self-care is the most important thing. But we're our own worst carers because of the way that we cannot get perspective, because of these distortions of the way that we view the world. So I think this sort of egocentric view of happiness is misguided. I'm not suggesting that you don't kind of consider your situation, but I think there's been too much emphasis. You know that L'Oreal advert, is that because you're worth it. I think that speaks volumes about this kind of current theme about focusing all your efforts on yourself, and I think that's misplaced.
Yeah, there was an Ellen DeGeneres riff. She was commenting on those commercials for antidepressants and anti-anxiety drugs. You know, like, do you ever feel anxious or sad? And she goes, yeah, I'm alive.
Exactly. Yeah.
This is normal.
Yeah.
I have noticed in teaching over, 40 years now, I never used to get, requests from students or letters from the psych department or the psychologist at the university that so-and-so has to be dismissed or given extra time or doesn't have to participate in any interactions with other students in discussions, or worse of all, give a public talk in the class. Because in my class at Chapman, I taught for 12 years, they all had to do a student TED Talk. So of course, every year, public speaking is very normal to be anxious about that. I mean, Jerry Seinfeld has a riff about this, excuse me, where people would rather be dead than, they fear death more than public speaking.
Yeah,
so he says, if you're at a funeral, you'd rather be the corpse than the eulogist.
Actually, you reminded me of I was watching one of these breakfast news shows, and this was a few years back, and they had a veteran who'd been fighting out in Afghanistan, I think at the time, and he was petrified on the car. That we have this couch, we're supposed to be cozy and chatting away to the TV host. And he said, "You know what? I'd rather be on the battlefield than here. This is terrifying." Oh, yeah. So, and it is actually the number one anxiety. I mean, in terms of people seeking treatment, social anxiety, speaking in front of others, is the most difficult thing for them. And we get that amongst our students as well. So part of what I do on this course I teach them techniques which really just prepare them for how to speak in public. So yeah, I mean these are
what would you recommend?
Well, psychological distancing is a good one. This is Ethan Kross's technique. So this is because we use the first person perspective. I feel this, but if you prepare for it using psychological distancing like third person, such as Bruce is really worried about his conversation with Michael Shermer because he thinks that he may not be sounding too fluent, and that will upset him. Whereas if I was to say, I'm worried about my talk with Michael Shermer because I think I'm going to... So by using first person, you're amplifying the negative aspects of it. So first person amplifies both negative and positive emotions. But if you distance yourself by talking about yourself in the third person, then that attenuates it. And the only people who ever do that are the royals. You don't have them, but we have them in this country. They talk about themselves in the third person.
The royal they.
We are not amused. Yeah. I don't think it'll be long before Trump starts speaking like that, actually. So I think he does. Actually, I think he does speak in the third person, which is a very peculiar oddity. But yeah, it actually can be a useful technique preparing for presentations. I use it sometimes.
Yeah. Well, so most of the students I've had that say, I just can't do this student TED Talk. Yes, you can. It's going to be great. It's going to be epic. I'm going to work with you. And then they do it and they all feel, really good about it afterwards. I did have one, the very last semester I taught last year. She just couldn't do it. She was so frail and just so afraid. I didn't want to push her.
Yeah, don't want to push it. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there are ways of doing that. I mean, I would suggest you probably see a therapist. If you use a graded exposure technique, which is, you gradually kind of work them up to the full thing. But that takes time and effort. But you're right. Generally, when they get through it, they're really so satisfied. But this is the danger. If they never allow themselves to test themselves, then they're never actually going to be able to overcome it. And, as I said to my students, life isn't an MCQ. It's not a multiple choice questionnaire. You don't get through life just by kind of filling in assignments. Life is challenging. And we're sending them out the doors of the university, and they're not really prepared for life. And I think that's one of the sad things about higher education. It's become so focused now on outcomes, qualifications, without actually preparing them for the real world, which is changing so quickly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is like that viral video at Yale with Nicholas Christakis, where that woman was yelling at him, this is our home. You have to protect this in our home. And he's like, no, this is a college. This is not a home.
Yeah. Well, we've got a similar good thing going on now. Unfortunately, Bristol was one of the reasons I started the course in 2018 is we had a couple of suicides. And there's now a move to try and make universities have a duty of care, sorry. But effectively, it's just extending, the childhood. These are adults. I mean, they're technically and legally adults. So I think we've got to recognize that it's not always in the best interest to do this. So that I think
students that take your class, are they just intellectually curious, or are they personally looking for something?
It's a mixture. I'll tell you one of the reasons they think it's going to be an easy ride, because there's no graded examinations. So we don't have any term papers or any exams. And one of the reasons was it would have been hypocritical to kind of give them examinations, given that's what is making them upset. So I developed a way, and it's a credit-bearing course, and I think it's the only one I'm aware of, and even the one at Yale, upon which it was based. This is Laurie Santos's course. Laurie was kind to share her original notes with me, and then I put my version of the course together. Even the one at Yale has exams. But the way they get credit on my course is they have to turn up to the lectures, and they have to meet in small groups, and they have to write every week a journal entry. They have to keep a journal, and then they have to do a group project at the end. So there is a sort of output in that sense. But it doesn't have the usual format, which is lectures and then your examination, your MCQs or your term papers. And I think a lot of them thought that would be easy, but actually turning up, for 10 weeks each week is quite challenging for a lot of them. And in fact, a lot of them are trying to get very sneaky about kind of because we use apps to track their location and everything on the campus, and they're kind of trying to outwit us all the time. It's just a game for them. But yeah, it's a mixture. Some of them I think are seeking answers. I make a big point right at the beginning that it's not a mass therapy. Okay, so this is not going to be of use to people who actually have clinical problems. So in that sense, it's good because it sort of signposts the services that we do have for them. And I'm not denigrating, and there are people who have real problems, and we can't just dismiss that. But for a lot of students, I think they're kind of coming out of a school system which has led them to believe that the way to success is just to go through the higher education system and then onto the job market. And I make the point that higher education is one of the last opportunities they'll have the freedom to study things for curiosity's sake. And, that's a wondrous opportunity, because when you're in the world of work, that becomes increasingly hard. It's not until you retire again that you can have the freedom to do that. So I do point out to them that this is something that they got to really grasp with both hands. But unfortunately, a lot of them are just still following this recipe for success, which I think is increasingly looking inappropriate, given that, many of the jobs may not exist in 5 years' time. So we have to kind of recognize that the world is changing.
I was, on the first day of class, I put up that slide of that graph from that Journal of Irreproducible Results about the relationship between midterm and finals and the death of grandparents. And they get it and they laugh. I go, so don't even try, because I've heard all the excuses.
Yeah.
So that always helps. Yeah, I do think, kind of reflecting on the bigger problem, there is obviously something going on. How do you distinguish between somebody who, because you mentioned real clinical issues versus whatever else we're talking about here, normal life anxieties and sadness or whatever?
I think if you've got, obviously there are scales and spectrums here, but if someone is, not even leaving their dorm, or they're so paralyzed with fear, and they're having panic attacks, then that's somebody who really should be seeing a therapist. But if it's somebody just feeling miserable and, obviously anyone who's suicidal and suicidal ideation, one of the good things about our course is that because they're journaling every week, we're actually analyzing what they're writing. So we're running it through linguistic analysis softwares, and we're getting people to double check it just in case there's any sort of red flags. So I think that's actually one of the really good things about it, because very often these tragedies happen in isolation, or in terms of they don't come forward. And that was a problem in the past. I think it's better now because there's more services for these students, but suffering in silence was one of the issues. So I think we're kind of normalizing the whole approach, and we're kind of putting a very positive spin on it. And they get to meet in small groups as well. And that's interesting because the way that we've designed the course is that students who are on different kind of majors who would never normally meet are being put into small groups, which are mentored by a senior student. So they get to kind of talk to them. I mean, the trouble of having someone as old as me talking to an 18-year-old, I'm just not relevant to them anymore. So I think the way that we've done this by peer-to-peer learning is actually quite ingenious. It really does kind of give a much better sort of interaction, as it were.
Yeah, I was reading that recent meta-analysis on SSRIs and how for mild to moderate depression, exercise is better than these medicines. Anyway, I was telling a friend of mine up here, one of the moms of my kid's school, about this, and she proceeded to tell me about all the meds she's on. I said, well, why don't you just work out? What would happen if you just stopped taking your meds? She goes, I'd be at the psych ward down there. I wouldn't be here at home. I'm like, oh, okay. In that case, keep taking your drugs. So there's I guess a sliding scale, but at some point it tips over into behavioral change or life effect. If your spouse leaves you or if you get fired, if you can't get out of bed, then that's the problem. It's defined behaviorally, maybe.
Yeah, if it starts to get in the way of you living a normal life, then clearly there's something that has to change. I mean, to be honest, our course works. So I don't know if you're aware, but we actually run a statistical analysis on it. So we give them a whole bunch of standardized psychometric measures before the course and after the course, and we have a waiting list control. So when we ran it in 2 terms, we'd have 300 doing it one term and 300 doing it in the following term in the spring break, and we could compare them, and then because they're matched, and you find there's a significant effect. Now that effect is not massive; it's about a 15% increase, 10 to 15%, because we use different measures. But that's not bad. Not bad for 10 weeks. And who wouldn't want to be 10 to 15% healthier or happier or wealthier? The problem is we've got a paper coming out next week. It goes back to baseline. If they don't keep up with the activities within about 3 months, they're miserable again. So that's something to bear in mind. It's not like there's a silver bullet. It's just like any other aspect. You've got to keep at it, because in the students, and there was around about half of them who kept up with the activities that we recommended, they were still maintaining their elevated levels of happiness, well-being is a more technical term, 2 years later. So it's exactly like physical exercise. You've got to keep at it because of the way our brains are always kind of focusing on negative things. So you can change for the long term, but you need to put the effort in.
So it's really a everyday keep doing it until it becomes second nature. It's just part of your habit.
Yeah, it is. I think, and there's not one thing there's not one size fits all. There's some things, for some people it's exercise. For others, there's meditation. For some, it's more kind of absorbing hobbies. It doesn't really matter. There are different things produce different types of benefits. But if you keep up with them, I think I'm now a convert. I was skeptical, to be honest, when I started. I'm a well-known skeptic, but when I heard about these psychoeducational courses make a difference, I was really not sure about that. And a lot of the papers, to be frank, are really weak and flaky. But we've been pretty thorough and rigorous. We've done it all pre-registered. We're kind of using powerful statistical modeling, and I'm now a convert. I believe it can make a difference, only if you keep up with it, though.
The light bulb has to really want to change.
That's true.
How many psychologists take a change of light? Yeah. Well, I agree with you. I followed the same pathway. We debunked the whole self-help movement and gurus and the Tony Robbins type people years ago. But since then, I've been kind of rethinking this, So the book was Self-Help and Actualization Movement, SHAM. That we published an excerpt from that as a cover story in Skeptic, because the guy who wrote it, he was the Rodeo Press editor and acquisition editor for their self-help books. And he said the number one predictor of who would buy a self-help book is who's already bought self-help books. So the joke was, if it works, why do you need it? Why do you keep needing to buy the tapes and buy the posters and the books and the workbooks and all that stuff? But the answer seems to be because you do have to re-up every day. It's like, okay, this is a new day. Entropy is going to take its toll. The second law of thermodynamics is going to grind away at us. There's a reason for the negativity bias, because there's way more things for way more ways for things to go wrong than go right. So you got to kind of re-up every day, work out, pay attention, get your ducks in order and set your goals every single day. So maybe the self-help tools are just kind of a reminder, almost like church. It's like every week I go in there and they remind me, be a good person. Don't forget to donate. Think good thoughts about so-and-so who's not doing well. And it's just kind of a behavioral strategy.
Yeah. I mean, there's nothing I mean, there are obviously some techniques which are, each chapter ends with a series of suggested techniques. And there's your usual suspects like, kindness and gratitude letters. But there's other stuff which people wouldn't have normally thought about, which I've included, which I think, for example, I teach the technique of box breathing. So that's a technique to trigger parasympathetic systems. So, when you're anxious or you're getting the fight or flight response, that's a autonomic sympathetic response. But the controlled breathing triggers the parasympathetic, the compensatory mechanisms. And I explain why that works and what's going on there. And I explain, for example, why the loneliness is triggering the kind of the fight flight, which is presumably having an impact on your immune system because it compromises your ability to, in the long term, as it were, the so-called hypothalamal pituitary axis, which is your kind of compensatory mechanism during fight flight. So there's stuff in there which isn't your usual self-help.
Can you explain the box breathing thing? I read that in the book.
Oh, sure, yeah.
What am I supposed to do again?
Well, it's okay. So you visualize a box, okay, and interestingly, I do this sometimes in public lectures. Someone came up to me and they have this really weird condition, very rare. They can't visualize images, but for most of us, we can visualize a square, and you're supposed to count in for a count of 4 up the side of the square, and then you hold for a count of 4 along the top. Then you come down, breathe out slowly for a count of 4. And then you wait for another count of 4, and you just keep going around. And the reason you visualize it is it's much easier to structure your breathing rather than just trying to voluntarily control it. If you just visualize it, it just seems to add that structure, which makes it much easier to do. Apparently, it's used by the U.S. Army. The SEALs use it for combat. I've used it on turbulence on airplanes because I know the plane's not going to follow the sky. But you do get that kind of automatic, fight flight. So it does works for that.
Interesting. All right. So let me just read a little portion from your book here. This is you. My own childhood was unhappy. I was raised in an itinerant family, constantly moving from one country to another because of an abusive, unhappy, alcoholic father, seeking employment, purpose, and meaning in his life. He died when I was 15. Leaving me to fend for myself after my mother returned to her native Australia 2 years later. In spite of this traumatic childhood, I regard myself as a relatively happy adult. I don't know why this is the case, but I do know it is possible to make people happier through education. I have the evidence to back that up. Okay, so, just in terms of causality, of course, whenever somebody has a problem, okay, let's look at their childhood. What happened to them? All right, so you had negative stimuli there and conditions. How come you didn't turn out like your dad?
Well, it could be the genes. We talk about the role of genetics in personality, and this has been looked at identical and non-identical twins, and you can do analysis and factor out through behavioral genetics what is the contribution of the genes. And it's pretty much the same as intelligence, around about 50%. That's the so-called heritability. That is often misunderstood. Some people talk about heritability is like a proportion of a proportion of your variance in your behavior. But don't forget, that's the average. That's the average for an entire population. There'll be some people who are very much like their parents and some people who are very unlike their parents. So it could be the case that even though the heritability is only around about 40 to 50% for happiness, I may have not my father. It could have been my grandfather or on my mother's side. So we don't know. I mean, we simply don't have the information about what's dominant here because these are multifactor or polygenic kind of things. You can't nail it down to one specific gene, as it were. So I think I've always challenged myself. I think in my personality, I've always been entrepreneurial. I see opportunity where people see kind of setback. I've always been optimistic, I think, even with that kind of miserable childhood. And it wasn't great at the time, but it didn't traumatized me to the extent that for some people, terrible childhood leave a lasting legacy. And that's why I say I don't know. I could speculate as to what's gone differently for me. I've been very lucky, and I think that's something. I'll tell you something, actually, Michael. It was higher education, I think, because I was really awful at school. I actually flunked out a lot of stuff. But a light bulb
high school?
moment.
The equivalent of high school?
Yeah. I didn't even get into university. I failed all my exams, and it was really, I managed to get through. I scraped into the local university in Scotland. And then something went off in the last year. I was doing a project. That's what I was working on, my research on, because I'm a developmentalist. I study infants, and I had this idea for a very cool experiment. Back then, I thought it was very cool. So filming babies in complete darkness to see if they have any understanding of the permanence of the world around them. And that just lit something in me that I just became so enthusiastic and passionate about consciousness and the mind and psychology. And I knew from that moment what I wanted to do. And that's what I've really been pursuing it in various forms. So I guess that for me, whatever problems I'd had up to that point were just put aside. And I suddenly found I had purpose. And that's what I that enthusiasm and passion for understanding and knowledge. I think we share this. I mean, I think, there's something about understanding the world around us I find endlessly fascinating and fulfilling. And I think in the book I talk about, this kind of quest to try and understand things. Richard Feynman, for example, he talks about that. How when someone asks you why did something happen, okay, there's this famous YouTube video if you ever get the time, and I think some reporter says, "Why do magnets repel?" Or what's going on with magnets? And the guy says, and Feynman says, "Well, they're just repelling each other." And he says, "Yeah, but why do they repel each other?" And then it gets into this long, convoluted, recursive discussion. And the point is, there's no answer because it keeps going down. You can never get to a finite answer. And I think that's wonderful because that's science, isn't it? It's this kind of constant, refinement of our models of the world, our understanding of the world, and it's alive and it's constantly changing. Which is one of the reasons I was so against traditional religions, because for them the story was over, but for science, it was a totally different view on the universe. There were still things to find out. So
yeah, the God did it answer is not a good explanation. I just made this equivalency argument in a debate when somebody made that argument about God. Well, God did it. It's like if I watch Penn and Teller do the double bullet, catch.
Yeah.
And I go, how did they do that? And you go, well, they use magic. I said, I know they use magic. I want to know how they did it.
Yeah.
So for the theist or whoever, they use magic or God did it, and then a miracle happened is the answer, but it's not a good answer. I've been playing with this idea in my next book on truth that, I was reading Thomas Nagel's one thought too many idea. Can you use rationality to prove that rationality works or whatever? It's like that's one thought too many. It just is. It's a tool that we use. Or like, well, why is it that like Descartes, I think, therefore I am. Yeah, but why? Like, no, just stop. Just you are. That at some point you just have to say, the universe exists. Yeah, but where did the universe come from? Well, okay. Well, we don't know. It's like at some point explanation just stops. You can't go back any further.
Yeah. I mean, I use that kind of recursive way of thinking as one of the suggestions in the chapter 7, I think it is, where I say, look, if you take a walk, and it doesn't matter if you live in the city or if you live out in the countryside, and you stop and you just ask the question, where did that building come from? Who built it? And you can keep going to recur. And suddenly, you're entering into a mindful exercise, if you like, because you're becoming aware of those little things that you don't notice because we're on autopilot most of the time. We spend our days not even thinking about what we're doing quite often. And that's perfectly, that's where you start to get this problem of mind wandering, which leads to rumination. So one of the suggestions is that actually just take the time to think about, first of all, how remarkable it is that you're alive, because that's a rarity in the first place. The fact you're not going to be around for much longer, again, all right, might be kind of a negative thinking, but it does sort of focus the mind as to the wondrous aspects of life. And I think just looking around your environment, asking, why is that like that? And how did that get there? And, I don't know if you know this, but in the end, I talk about my passion for metal detecting. Okay, I took this up again during the
the Roman coins. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Well, you live in a good place for that.
Yeah, Somerset. Yeah, exactly. I used to do it as a kid, of course. That's part of how the whole psychedelic thing story unfolds. But anyway, I still get enormous satisfaction and pleasure of uncovering something that was last held by somebody 2,000 years ago. And I just feel, oh my goodness, that's amazing. And it's really it's kind of interesting when I tell people about it. I was doing an interview with a Sunday
stone tools here that are like 100,000 years old.
Yeah,
this one's
awesome.
from Denmark. It didn't have that label on it when it was originally made. But that some hominid
somebody would have held that in their hand. Yeah,
astonishing, just astonishing.
Yeah. There's something tactile about these things as well. That's I'm very interested in essentialism. My whole thing about.
Yep.
That'll be my next book, by the way. I'm sure.
Essentialism?
Yeah. This is the metaphysical property that we attribute to the world.
Wasn't this in your SuperSense book?
It was originally, yeah. So that was the story of the killer's cardigan stunt I used to do in audiences. So
I lecture about that. I have a picture of you with the Mr. Rogers sweater versus Hitler's jacket.
Yeah. So part of that is essentialism, because there's this idea that the essence of Hitler or the killer is somehow embodied in the physicality of the object. And I think that's true. You can get both negative and positive essentialism. So when it's holding those stone axes, I'm sure that's a kind of a positive essentialism. That was held by someone, a great ancestor. What were they thinking back then? What was their lives like? What would they have made of technology where we're kind of speaking, and we're on the opposite sides of the planet now. We're speaking in real time, and it's mind blowing.
Yeah. So, in terms of understanding causality in the social sciences and behavioral sciences, I think the problem is even worse than we think it is. Not just since the replication crisis, but you talked about the 50% heritability. Okay, where's the other 50%? Well, the environment. Yeah. All right, so you have these, controlled studies, behavior genetics, identical twins raised in the same home, separate homes, and on and on and on. You go, okay, but there's still a huge explanatory gap. Identical twins raised in the same home, they're really quite different.
Yeah,
so then you
true.
get down to life history, and then you get down to like the individual life history of the one person. You guys, we all deal in large data sets, but that person right there. How come they're, so why are you different from your dad? Not just on average abusive parents and abused children or whatever.
Yeah.
But, you. So, I think of it like this, that, you went left instead of right, or you zigged instead of zagged. You had the upper bunk and your brother had the lower bunk, or you met this teacher and they became inspirational and your twin didn't have that teacher. Just the individual contingent events that redirect things. And I think that is way more powerful than anybody's really. I got this idea in part from Brian Klass's new book called Fluke.
Yeah.
So he has a whole chapter on that. So he's a social scientist. He's a political scientist. And that he studies political revolutions around the world. He said, we have no idea when these are going to happen. Nobody does. They cannot be predicted. Almost like predicting who's going to commit suicide or who's going to be the next school shooter. Impossible. You can't know.
Yeah.
In part because the person themselves, they don't know.
Yeah.
Like people who commit suicide and fail and then they get interviewed and so on, almost always say, well, I don't know what came over me. I just got up that morning and boom, it just happened. And, why would Putin invade? Maybe Putin didn't know he was going to invade Ukraine on that particular day. Maybe he's just like, I'm just going to see how it goes. And then maybe or maybe not. And it's highly contingent. Yeah. And so I was writing about this and then I'll stop about this fragile families study here, data collected over 15 years on 4,242 at-risk families from Fragile Families and Child Wellbeing Study database. I think it's all here in the U.S. They were 160 teams of social scientists were tasked with predicting 6 life outcomes. For example, child GPA, family material hardship, parental eviction or employment, based on various causal variables such as employment, income, education, health, environment, relationship with extended kin, marriage attitudes, fatherhood, father-mother relationships, interviews, and in-home assessments. The research teams employed not only the usual statistical tools and methods all social scientists are trained to use, but AI machine learning programs as well. The results were underwhelming, to say the least, quoting from the authors. Even though the fragile family's data included thousands of variables collected to help scientists understand the lives of these families, participants were not able to make accurate predictions for the holdout cases. Further, the best submissions, which often used complex machine learning methods and had access to thousands of predictor variables, were only somewhat better than the results from a single benchmark model that used linear regression, continuous outcomes, or logistical regressions, binary outcomes, with 4 predictor variables selected by a domain expert. So, I mean, even with all that, it's just so difficult, because I think it's just because life is very contingent.
Yeah. But I do, I agree. I mean, there is, I think there's a couple of studies I mentioned in the book that one of the surprising variables, which, again, I'm sure if it was run through the right analysis, it might be questionable. But there is this issue about, happier children tend to grow up into happier adults. But then there's no kind of knowledge about what makes for the happier kid other than the fact they're getting on with others. I suppose that gets, that's more grist to the mill, that really, there are so many contingent factors which determine how happy you are as a kid. It's not just your disposition. There's all, as you say, there's the other kids on the block. You don't control those sorts of things. There's all these random factors. But yeah, there is some work suggesting that actually, and this supposedly it predicts kind of 40 years later, much better than things like your university degrees or your professional qualifications. So there is this argument, there is this sort of legacy that seems to stay with us. And I could kind of get that. And I could see the causal mechanism would be generally happier people, you want to be around them, you want to do things with them. People who are miserable from a very start they're not going to get the promotions. They're not going to get all those other opportunities. There's something, positivity has a kind of contagious aspect to it, I think. And so if there is this mechanism, that's what I would suggest is going on.
It's like in Sapolsky's new book on called Determined. He has just countless studies of like little things that social scientists don't think about. Like if you're twins in a womb, one is on top of the other one, or one has slightly more blood from the mother than the other.
Yeah.
It's like, how is this even factored into some study you would do on happiness or something like that? Or even in neural development, identical twins, just the one neuron went left and the other one went right, or, made this connection instead of that connection. They're not identical. Yeah. And, I think a lot of this is, making it impossible to make predictions. So you're working with big data sets. We say on average, this makes people happy. Yes, but what about me? And so the more factors you add into it, like if you had, instead of 6, you had 100 variables, the sample size, no matter how big you started off, it would just reduce down to, then we're talking about you. You're the one, you grew up in this house with this particular person. You went to that school with that teacher. And all of a sudden there's no data set at all. We're just talking about you and your life history.
Well, I do actually. I mean, I do say that when I start my course, I said not all of you are going to get anything out of this, but on average, the group as a whole will show a 10 to 15%, and it'll go probably back down to 0 if you don't keep up with it. So you're right. I can't say with any certainty what an individual will get out of it, or whether we can increase an individual's situation. But I think that as I said, I try not to oversell this. Because I think that's one of the problems with the whole self-care thing is it's generally oversold that this is a remarkable, you'll be transformed into a deliriously happy person. That's not going to happen. But it's not even the primary purpose of the course, to be honest. I mean, for me, it's really just bringing to their attention all these other collateral things, which I think are really important, which is, are you making the right choices in life? So, we question about the pursuit of wealth and the pursuit of materialism, and you think all these things are going to make you happier. They're not necessarily going to do so. So I think just broadening out, at least trying to unpick the kind of recipe they've been given from a very early age, that there's a certain strategy for happiness, is not true.
Yeah, you cite here that when you ask people what will make them happy, they cite things like wealth, a good job, fame, sex, loving relationships, luxuries, and a perfect body. How about just one that works pretty well?
Yeah.
Well,
Actually,
so I guess the question is, what's the metric? Why is it happiness? Why are we using that word? Why not leading a purposeful, meaningful life, even if you're not happy doing it?
Yeah, well, that was a deliberate decision to use a word which was familiar. I don't like the word. I prefer well-being, and even then, you can sort of fractionate that into different things. So there's there's an emotional component of happiness, which is that feeling, but there's also a sense of contentment, achievement. This is more what Marty Seligman talks about. So it's more the term that Aristotle talked about, which is eudaimonia. So even actually in the Greeks, I mean, there's Aristippus who talked about hedonism. So hedonism is a sort of, maximizing pleasure, minimizing pain. And Aristotle said, well, that's just animalistic. Any animal can do that. What you should be doing is you should be seeking to enrich the world around you and enrich others through flourishing. And this is his concept of eudaimonia. So, and I think that's true. I think there's different types of positive experiences that you can generate. Those are, there's happiness, but there's also a kind of sense of purpose, a sense of achievement, a sense of progress. And that can be satisfying. It doesn't necessarily generate, this delirious happiness, but probably more a sense of contentment. Someone actually asked me, what's your definition of happiness? I said, well, look, frankly, it's I'm okay, the situation's okay, and it'll generally be okay. But that's not a very satisfying explanation. But that's really what I think. It's not this kind of I'm deliriously happy. It's actually, you know what? I've got a lot going right in my life, and I shouldn't be so worried about it. So it's almost that, I think, is what I'm trying to capture. But we use the word happy because, well, frankly, most people use that and they kind of have a general idea what it is. If you called it a course on the science of subjective well-being and contentment, it would just it wouldn't really ring. And people want simple solutions. Every time I do an interview, and thank God you're not doing this, Michael, they always say, "What's your top tip? Give me your three best happiness." It's like, you don't want to put any work into it. You just want to kind of take a pill and be happy. Well, you can do that, but that's not going to make you happy in the long run.
Yeah. But I mean, a lot of things I do that I find fulfilling, like working out, going for a hard bike ride, or I don't know, back when my parents are still alive, caretaking for my older parents. It's not fun. I'm not happy doing it, but I feel better about myself. I'm glad I did it. Maybe it's short term versus long term. It's it's about somebody else rather than about me. I am happy, like going out for drinks and dinner tonight with my friends. That'll be fun. I'll be happy doing that. But tomorrow, it's like, well, that was done. It doesn't really matter now. What am I going to do tonight? As opposed to, well, I did this thing. I finished my chapter for my next book. I feel good about myself that I finished that, and that's much longer lasting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're right there. And I think I talk about at the end. There's a difference between things that you do for yourself, which make you happy, and things that you do for other people. So the things you do for yourself, that kind of generates happiness, but it's very short-lived. And the reason is because you're the instigator, purveyor, and the recipient of it. So you kind of know when it's over. Whereas if you actually direct your efforts to enriching the lives of others around you, you're never fully aware of when that ceases to lose its value to them, and it amplifies. So, for example, I often give out a tub of candies, in my lectures. Now, I could eat that full tub of candy myself. I'd make myself sick, but I probably would be sick of it, But by giving out candy to each and every all the students, I'm amplifying the little benefit boosts, and then they go away and come back, and guess what? They bring me stuff back the following week. So it kind of has this legacy aspect of it when you direct your efforts towards the others around you. And there's some research showing that the happiness directed allocentrically, which is this term I use throughout the book, which is other focused, is more sustained and more authentic. Whereas if you're just buying, if you're doing your self-care and putting your own, that doesn't last as long, and you can't fool yourself. When it's no longer much fun. So that's why I suggest that you need to get the balance right.
But when you do this, when you do something allopatric, you do something for somebody else.
Yeah.
Are you doing it because it makes you feel better to do something for somebody else, or do you actually really feel good about doing something?
Well, interestingly enough,
I would think there would be an evolution for actually feeling it. Like, I really believe this is a good thing. I feel good about myself.
You do actually. There's some studies showing exactly that effect. So it turns out that the the reward centers, the ventral striatum areas of the brain, they're activated when you start doing allocentric or acts of kindness for other people. But there's a really interesting episode of Friends where Joey and Phoebe are having an argument, and Phoebe's arguing that Joey is being selfish, and he says, well, you're selfish. You had these kids for your brother. And he makes the point as well, it made you feel good. So therefore, by definition, it's a selfish act. So yeah, absolutely. When you're helping others, you do literally feel better yourself. And that, as I said, it shows up in the ventral striatum.
See, what I'm looking here for is some kind of outside of yourself grounding of ethics and morals. So here's the scenario. So I'm debating Dinesh D'Souza, who's a Christian and theist and so on, about the origins of morality. So we got to talking about Peter Singer's thought experiment. You're walking along a path and there's a pond and somebody's drowning and you're wearing a pair of $700 leather boots. Would you run in there and save them? Well, of course I would. I'm going to sacrifice my $700 boots for save the person's life. And then of course his denouement there is like, well, you can send $700 to this charity right now and do the equivalent of saving this person. Right? Why aren't you doing that? Well, I really like my boots. Right. So for Dinesh, that's a kind of utilitarian calculus that doesn't count as real morality. But my counter to that is, but when you do these things, most people are not doing it in some calculated way because, reciprocal altruism, maybe this person will do something nice for me, or it signals to my social group that I'm a reliable person. I'm doing it for that calculation. But that, in fact, we feel good about it inside. Like, I really want to do this because I really feel like that's the right thing to do and I feel better. And is that enough to count as a objective external source of morality without God? You see, I'm not going for the God thing because theists say, well, there has to be this outside source or it doesn't really count. You see where I'm going with that? Yeah.
Well, Abraham Lincoln's famous quote, when I do good, I feel good. That's my religion.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, you have that in the book. Yeah, I like that. Yeah. I think that seems to me that should be good enough. Why is that not good enough?
I'm not disagreeing with you. I think that's fine.
No, I know, but the theist does, right?
Yeah.
So I guess the argument in kind of a mechanical way, well, you get a hit of dopamine. That doesn't feel like it's something, I don't know, genuine or inside, but that is this is good as we can get, right? Your brain is rewired to do good, and you feel good about that. Anyway, in my mind, that's enough of an argument. It's not about me. It comes bundled with the species. We get this as Homo sapiens, that we're a social primate species, and so the psychopath who pretends to be a good person and knows what kind of signals to fake to fool people into thinking he's empathetic, people find out about him if they spend enough time with him. He's like, that guy, I don't really trust him. I think he's bullshitting me. Whereas you're a good friend. I know I can trust you because I've spent time with you. That's where the difference comes from. Genuine friendship as opposed to a Machiavellian manipulation friendship.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think these are automatic, and in the same way that ostracism is automatic, that's the negative version of it. So it's not like you're kind of thinking it through. When you know how fast it happens. If someone rejects you, or you get that sudden, my God, and it's very powerful. There's a very powerful motivating factor. So I think in the case of doing, you're right. It just feels good, and you don't have to kind of rationalize it in any sense.
It's like the evolutionary psych business about tipping in a foreign city that you're never going to go to. You're never going to see this person again. Why would you tip them? And the answer seems to be because I actually feel better about myself as a person, and I'm more likely to do. This is Aristotle's virtue ethics, right? Just act virtuous, and then you will become a virtuous person.
Yeah. And there's a lot of behavioral economics. All these studies, all these games that they play, the ultimatum games, that people, even when they don't have to, will give a proportion of the money back because they're kind of modeling it as if I was in that situation, I would have, so they're almost acting like, why is it the case that people do anonymous donations? That can't be explained by reciprocity theories or anything to do with signaling. And it's called the warm glow effect. It's what economists recognize. Even, Adam Smith recognized this, that within human nature, there is this tendency just to be good. And I think you're right.
There was an episode of Curb Your Enthusiasm with Larry David where he and some other rich guy were each making a donation to some hospital, and he really wanted people to know he was making the donation, but he wanted it to seem anonymous. But he tripped up, and people found out. He wanted people to know, and the other guy. He got found out accidentally. He's like, damn, I should have done that. So I got that credit instead of this credit. I guess there's probably always that tension.
I mean, don't get me wrong, there is definitely strategies which are signaling strategies, but there is also a component of human behavior which can't really be explained by that.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, on the money front, people always say, I wish I had more money. But you write about the hedonic treadmill in the book that there's never going to be enough because there's always somebody that has more. And then there's Elon at the top and you're never getting there, right? So, but it seems like there must be some lower level where, if you have enough money that you don't have to think about money, then that maybe is some minimum criteria.
Yeah, so there's a running debate at the moment with Danny Kahneman. Well, it's not running anymore; it's been resolved. But Danny Kahneman and Angus Dayton produced a paper a few years back showing that once you're at $65,000 at that time, which was the level of comfort, then there was no additional benefit really in terms of happiness for earning more money. But then Matt Killingworth published a paper showing that you continue to benefit as you earn more money, but it turns out that it all really comes down to your starting point. So if you're an unhappy person, more money will make you happier, but then it doesn't make you any. Once you've reached your comfort zone, as it were, additional money doesn't make any difference. So money does make people happier. Certainly, they all feel more successful. I mean, that's one thing which is not criticized. People who are wealthier know they're more successful. I mean, it's basically they can see the car sitting in the driveway, but the extra utility value, I think, is questionable because it depends on how you go about getting it. If you earn it and it's through, satisfaction, I could see that actually continuing to deliver a sense of contentment and, happiness, as it were. If you inherit it, I doubt it will have the same impact of it because, once you've had luxury, it's fine. It's definitely a comfortable life, but having more luxury piled upon that, well, I don't think that necessarily, keeps delivering more and more delight.
Mm-hmm. I suppose it must also depend on what your hobbies are, or what you want to spend the money on.
Yeah, that's true.
In my case, I'm a cyclist, and so to me, to buy an $8,500 bike, every 3 or 4 years, that's it. But if I was a boat owner or I wanted a private plane or something, I would not have enough money. I would be totally stressed out, and the people I would hang out there would, I would be way below them rather than with my cycling buddies. I had plenty of money. So, I guess it's the social context and what everybody else around you is doing.
Yeah, well, that's the point I talk about. Social comparisons is what's making people unhappy. We tend to compare upwards. So on any metric, whether it's good looks or money or success, there's always someone better than you. We rarely, unless we're writing a gratitude letter, which is why they work, we rarely compare ourselves to those who are less fortunate. And if you do that, then suddenly you feel much better about yourself. For example, if you ask everybody who goes to more parties, who goes out socializing more, on a scale of 1 to 10, most people think they're below 5. They assume everyone else is having a better life than they are. And that's because of social media. Everyone's posting their best times. So it looks by comparison that you're not going out more than other people. But then if you get them to think of somebody who's actually very unfortunate, then they suddenly realize, oh yeah, actually, I'm probably doing a lot better than most people. But it's just our natural tendency to compare upwards. Well, it's like that study I think I mentioned about the Olympic finalists, the medalists.
Yes,
who's the happiest? Who's the happiest person on the podium? Well, it's two people. It's the gold medalist and the bronze medalist. The least happy person is the silver medalist, even though he came second. It's because he's comparing himself to the gold medalist, and the bronze medalist is comparing himself to everyone who didn't even get onto the podium. So you see, where you draw your comparisons will affect your.
Jerry Seinfeld has a riff about that too, about exactly what you just said. He said, but the silver medalist is the first loser, and the bronze medal, well, at least I won something. And then he adds to this, it's like, the gold medalist gets all the fame and money. And, everybody, Michael Phelps, I know him. Who was the guy that finished, 1/100th of a second behind him? Never heard of him. And I have read there's been attempts to add a fourth category, like a platinum or whatever. metal,
Oh,
but I don't
really?
think that would do. I don't think that would do anything because you would just then the fifth guy feels bad,
Yeah.
or there'd be two first losers or something like that. Well, the thing about money though, also it opens up opportunities to do other things. Like Elon could have just sold his PayPal share and just gone to the beach, as he said, but he didn't. So it just gives you, even if it doesn't make you any happier, but it allows you to do other things that you would not otherwise be able to do. I can start a charity, I can give my money away, I can start a new company, I can hire a gazillion people, I can try to colonize Mars or whatever. I mean, there's things that in the long run do things that you would not otherwise be able to do because you didn't have the money. So I don't like this attitude, money's just, it's the wrong goal, or there's something tainted about it. I don't know. It seems like if you use it right, it all makes so many more opportunities to do things that will bring fulfillment.
No, I do agree. I mean, I think it certainly buys you opportunity and choice. I mean, that's having no money means you have no choices. Like you have to work and you have to do this, and and so that's what I think is really But having too much choice can actually also be counterproductive. I mean, there's a lot of work by Barry Schwartz that's showing that. If you give people too many choices, they become indecisive, and then they become dissatisfied with the choice they did make because they realize they could have done other things. So yeah, no, I agree. I think that it's all too easy to say, "Oh, money is not worth it." But clearly, as you say, that it does open up many possibilities. It frees you up, and certainly in my case, Mae West said it best: "I've been rich and I've been poor. Believe me, being rich is better." Yeah.
I think they said that about looks and thinness. You can't be too rich or too thin. You can be too thin now. I guess that's the problem.
Yeah, that's true.
Or too fat. Right. Yeah, the immigrant. I want to live in a country where the people are too fat. Coming from a country where everybody's starving. Yeah. So, how is happiness studied? I mean, there's these techniques where they, back in the day when they had, the little beepers, something like that. Because it depends on when you ask me these questions during the day, or what part of my life, or I'm in a bad mood when you happen to ring me up.
Yeah, so that's we're just finishing a study on that this week. Actually, we've been you're talking about experience sampling. So we've got these apps on their phones. We just randomly contact them at different points of the day and saying, "What are you doing right now, and how happy are you?" The way it's measured generally is by self-report. And actually, that's probably the most relevant measure when you think about it, because if you stick an electrode in the brain, it doesn't really necessarily correlate with your behavioral experience. And ultimately, if you say I'm feeling unhappy or I'm feeling happy, that's the most relevant measure. But yeah, these are kind of what they do. I mean, they're usually questionnaires which are extended over time, and they're not ideal, and they're subject to biases that, as you point out, that happiness will fluctuate in the day. But again, that's why you kind of have to look at larger numbers and repeat your measures in order to get some sense of it. But yeah, there's no other real way of doing that. I mean, actually asking people is probably better, but that's really difficult. If you have family members or partners or whatever, they're pretty good at kind of reading other people in terms of how well they're doing at any point in time. But that's a difficult technique.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was just looking at this ultimate personality test that I took online. They combined the Big Five with the what's the other one? The MBTI style test, and so on. And so just for fun, I mean, I'm aware of these, but I just took it this morning just for fun. And a lot of the questions are like, well, if you're at a party, do you like to talk to everybody or just one or two people? Or do you prefer to be? They were looking for like the CEO personality. Do you like to lead? Or do you like to follow? Or it's like, well, it depends. I mean, so much depends. Which party? Who's there? Yeah. And for the most part, I don't like being a CEO. I don't like having a bunch of employees. But on the other hand, I like that I can just make the decisions myself. I don't know. It seems so context dependent. I guess if you average them all out over huge databases, you see differences where some people really are more open to experience and others are not, or conscientious or not, something like that.
Well, I think another example of that is pessimism and optimism. We can be both, depending on what you're considering. So just generalizing and saying, oh, he's a pessimist or he's an optimist. I mean, that kind of is a little bit of an overstatement, overgeneralization. But then, I think it is true that whilst we are complex animals, there are some people you'd rather be around, and there are some people you wouldn't rather be around. And I think that in that kind of broad strokes approach, what I'm kind of referring to, these sort of general measures, as it were. But yeah, you're right. I mean, within our lives, there are different domains which are working, and there are ones which are not working. And trying to capture that with a questionnaire is not always going to be sufficient.
Okay, some other fun topics from your book. Life history strategy. I had Gene Twangy on the show for Book Generations. Unbelievably interesting theory. Life history theory. So the longer you live, the slower your life development can be. You don't have to rush and get married at age 19 and have a kid at 20 and so on. You can do it in your 30s, which is apparently what happens. She said that the average woman now, between my generation, baby boomers, and the current generation, is 10 years when they have their first child, from 19 to 29. So and then instead of having 2.5 kids or whatever, you have one.
Yeah.
And so this is her explanation for she doesn't go for the screen time so much as what's the current problem. It's the coddling by parent. Why are parents coddling these kids? Well, because they're risk averse. And if you only have one, then you got to put all your resources into the one. And therefore play dates and make sure the playgrounds are super safe and so on. If you have 6 kids, well, whatever, just go out and hopefully come back for dinner. Right? Yeah.
That's an interesting one. I like that. I like that a lot. I mean, that reminds me of what was going on in China before, when they had the one-child policy. You remember they used to call them little emperors because all the resources. I mean, I actually saw this when I went to China. I was doing a lecture tour, and I would see this in the parks. You'd have one little kid being chased by 4 old elderly people, which, of course, are the 2 grandparents because the parents were in work. And they've got this one child. This one child is, this is their legacy because that's going to support them when they're, So, that's an interesting idea. I hadn't thought about that. It's quite good. I like it.
Yeah. So, and how does it work? Well, it's just the kind of norms around you that you don't even see. You're swimming in them. If none of your friends after you graduate from high school and college are getting married, none of them are having kids. They're all just pursuing careers slowly. And then you get into your 30s, and then maybe some of your friends by 35, 36, you go, I think I'll have a kid now. It's just kind of the way you think. Instead of like, all my friends are getting married and having kids in their early 20s, I better get with it. So it's not a calculation. It's just kind of the way the norms shift over time.
Well, that's true. I mean, I think you've got a daughter as well, but my daughters are at that. I've got a 30-year-old and a 24-year-old. And it doesn't look like there's any kids coming in the near future.
Soon, I know.
Yeah. So,
exactly.
They're aware of it, but I think you're right. Certainly a generation ago, it would have been an entirely different story.
Right. They're slower to get driver's licenses. I mean, half the kids now don't drive cars at 19, 20 or whatever. Yeah. They're having less sex, apparently. Maybe that's a good thing, fewer STDs and pregnancies.
Yeah, but they're drinking less as well, so that's one good thing.
That's probably good, yeah.
Yeah, they're doing more drugs, but they're drinking less in the
right.
UK.
They're microdosing.
They're microdosing. Indeed they are, yeah.
But I like that you add some evolutionary theory to it. Yesterday I was reading the book with the kids, and one of the kids' grandmothers was there, so I read to her the grandmother hypothesis.
Oh, that's wonderful, isn't it?
Yeah, explain that, yeah.
Okay, so there's some peculiar aspects about our life history strategies. We live, we live a long time, of course, and we haven't always lived a long time, but we live proportionally long times. And we have these really long childhoods relative to other mammals who are closest to us. And of course, one thing is different is that females live longer into beyond the menopause. And the question is, well, why is that? Why would you have someone sticking around if they're no longer capable? Well, the argument is I make in the book is that because we have these long childhoods, but it's to grow big brains, which is true. And you're probably aware of Robin Dunbar's social brain hypothesis. You've got these big brains to enable you to do social interaction, communication. Well, the problem is that big-brained babies are difficult to deliver. So we're probably again, there's some argument here, but generally speaking, humans tend to have assisted deliveries, okay? There are occasions where mothers will deliver by themselves, but for a lot of humans, giving birth is a really particularly difficult and dangerous, occupation and pastime. And then you've got to bring the child up and raise them over, through childhood. So that requires a lot of assisted delivery and resources. And this is probably where the grandmothers come in, or the aunts. So the early birthing partners would have been the the mother's mother, as it were, the grandmother, and the aunts. And so the grandmothers, the reason they stick around long is they provide all that additional resources, enabling the mothers to go on to have more children, and they can go back to having more babies. So the grandmothers are and actually it's been modeled quite interestingly. They've probably extended the human lifespan over the course of the last 60,000 years. They doubled it effectively, is the argument, according to the papers I was reading on this. So yeah, the grandmothers are around because they enable us to have these difficult childhoods.
Okay, so let's carry this out then. Why can't we live forever? Why don't we need great-great-grandmothers and great-great-great-grandmothers? Natural selection just doesn't see them because the genes are far enough down the road?
Yeah, we're built by genes, remember, and they're kind of killing us off just so that we can allow evolution to occur again, yeah. So they don't care about our individual lives. The genes are just they're deliberately killing us with cancers and so on.
But I mean, it's sort of like, why didn't natural selection get rid of Alzheimer's? It never saw Alzheimer's.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, by the time you're 25, you have your kids, whatever, in the Paleolithic, you're pretty much done. Or maybe you make it till 50, so your children have it, and your children's children, and that's it.
Well, of course, we are changing the metrics, of course, and so the natural selection is always there, but we're kind of fighting against it with the kind of our technologies. And yeah, we have increased life expectancy, obviously, over the past 100 years. It's gone up quite substantively. But the problem is that it'll correct itself because there's not enough youngsters to look after the old people. And this is actually not just a hypothetical, it's actually true. Korea's got a disastrous demographic time bomb. They're I think I heard this yesterday, they've fallen down to about 0.9. They've fallen below the critical ratio of having babies. So they're going to have this hugely aging population.
Same thing in Japan.
Yeah. And who's going to look after them? I mean, who's going to produce the food? And all right, maybe the AI and the robots will do it, but I don't know about that. I think we do kind of need other humans to look after us.
Yeah. I was thinking about Elon's been tweeting about this a lot recently. Japan's going to disappear, but it's a little bit like the in the population bomb days. And I'm reminded of Stein's law that things that can't go on forever won't.
Yeah.
People will just start having sex again. The norms will change and people want more kids. I don't know if this is going to happen, but, people say, well, the world's going to have, 100 billion or something. Well, no, things change.
Well, that's the good thing about selection. It's opportunistic. It's always looking for, as soon as something becomes dominant, it corrects again.
Right. So, yeah. Right. Okay, so you have a chapter on optimism. Am I just supposed to channel my inner happy puppy and think positive thoughts, or what's the?
Well, the optimism channel, yeah, it's basically reiterating a lot of Murray Seligman's ideas about Well, look, one of the things I think is really important when it comes to happiness is recognizing you can really make a difference by being truthful to yourself. In other words, documenting things in a way which is much more objective rather than trying to deal with it subjectively in your head. So I'm a big fan of journaling. I think it's just the process of writing something down in detail is a very valuable thing that we've kind of forgotten about because we just kind of live these digital lives and it's too easy to sort of put it on your computer. But, pulling out your journal from 15 years ago or whatever, and you sort of, God, I can't believe I was so obsessed with this person or I was so unhappy. It's a tangible evidence that things get better and you overcome things. And so I'm a big fan of journaling. And so the optimism thing is really writing everything down in as much detail as you possibly can, and then deliberately coming up with alternative, more positive ways of thinking about it. And this is a little bit like the psychological distancing I was telling you about. You kind of step out of yourself. You look back at your situation. You say, Bruce, pull your shit together, okay? It's not that bad. So you really got to act as if you're not that person. And that will actually change the way you feel about things. So I think Seligman argues that this will become second nature. I don't know about that, but I think I do it more now that I've been talking about it for about the past 5 years. I think I do. I don't seem to sort of, settle into that kind of, but then I generally have been an optimistic person for a while. I tend to see things, but yeah, I think that's an interesting exercise. Certainly the students who do it really enjoy it. Well, that's one of their exercises they have to do for one of these engagement things that we get them to do, journaling each week. they have to find something, and then they have to try and do this process. And yeah, they kind of report how much they really enjoy that. So yeah, I think writing it down, keeping a journal is a very valuable thing. Do you know that phenomenon I talk about in the book, that if you ask people, have you changed since you were a teenager? People say, yeah, I used to be a bit of a jerk. Are you going to change in the future? Everyone says, no, I'll be the same person. It doesn't matter who you ask. It's called the end of history illusion. Yeah, people think that they can kind of recognize they've changed, but they assume that they're finished. And that's kind of the interesting thing. I make the point, that's why the self is a construct. You're constantly at the whim of events and things in the future that you don't know are going to influence you.
Yeah, okay, let's talk about that for a second, because I mostly agree with you on that, particularly because it's so contingent, as I was saying earlier. But on the other hand, just say take the big five. I'm going to be within certain parameters most of my life, right? I'm such and such extroverted. I go between 5 and 7, say, and some days I'm a 7, some days I'm a 5, but I'm never going to be a 1 because just by temperament, right? So isn't there like some channels within, so you can bounce around within the channel, but for a lifespan, you're going to.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, yeah. I mean, if you're a humorous person, you're probably going to be a humorous person for a while, as an example. So I think that's probably true. I wouldn't disagree with that. But I think this is a study from Dan Gilbert. There's a lot of Dan's work in here. Dan's an old friend of mine, but he made this point that we just kind of have this myopic view on things. I mean, that's a general point, actually. This term myopic. I didn't use that in the book, but it is true that we do kind of have a very restrictive viewpoint on things, and certainly, we justify our reasons. We kind of have all these, as you're probably well aware, there's all these biases to make sense of things after the fact, or we only focus on what's consistent with our internal belief systems. So there is a kind of a lot of distortions going on, but yes, I think that there's certainly different types of people, and there are personality characteristics which probably are generally true, but I think the point is that they can change to some extent.
I had a professor as an undergraduate at Pepperdine who told me I was too serious. You need to develop a sense of humor, lighten up. And I thought, oh, okay, I'll do that. And so I do try to do that. I'll never be Robin Williams, but who
would want to be Robin Williams? I mean, gosh,
that's a little too much, yeah. But maybe that's easier when you're 18, 19-year-old than when you're in your 60s. I don't know to what extent you can change your personality.
Yeah, I think I've changed. I mean, someone was asking me about this again recently, and I think it's age. I've become a little bit more acutely aware of the finite time I have left.
Cramming for the final.
Well, I'm just trying to use it a little bit more. I don't know. I think I was a very driven person. I was very productive when I was a young academic. You had to be. And then, obviously I was at Harvard, which when you're immersed in environments like that, you can't help but be competitive because they are so challenging environments. Now I've kind of lightened up a lot, partly because I don't have to prove myself anymore. Although having said that, writing a book is thrown me right back into the kind of anxiety about, oh my God, what are the critics going to make of it? And so, yeah, I guess that I haven't entirely lost that strive, that necessary to strive. But I think I feel a little less anxious. Well, not anxious was not the right word. I mean, a little less eager than I was, 30 years ago.
Yeah. I've, that fear of missing out or fear of being left out, such a, youthful Gen Z kind of thing. But I feel that because the only social media I do is Twitter. And I follow people like you and Steve Pinker and Richard Dawkins and Dan Dennett and so on. And it's like, no matter how successful I am or how many good things that happen, I always think, yeah, but how come I didn't get invited to that conference? Or you gave those Christmas lectures. It's like, that's so, how come I didn't get good for, wait a minute, how come I'm not getting something like that? And it's so easy to slip into that. And it seems like everybody has a new book out. It's like, I've written 15 books. I feel like I'm so behind. I'm just worthless. It's just ridiculous.
Well, yeah. I mean, actually, as I said, I mean, this book, I had a real problem getting this published in the US because of the competition. Like, unless you have a platform, excuse me, unless you have a platform in the US, it's very hard. Excuse me.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I saw that. It's not on Amazon yet, so we're gonna release this when it finally comes out.
Well,
Simon
I
and
really
Schuster. I mean, come on, they should bring it out here. And I
Yeah,
will say,
well,
if anyone at Simon and Schuster listening to this, I've read all of the happiness books, and I've had all these people on my podcast, and yours really is different. It really is adds a lot that I did not know.
I really appreciate that. I'm showing
Maybe
gratitude there.
I'll send you a blurb. You can send that to the
no,
publisher.
definitely. That'd be. I really would appreciate that, Michael. I value your opinion because I know that you think about these things quite deeply and you are concerned about them. So, you can get blurbs from all sorts of people, but there are certain individuals that you just know that they kind of think things through, and I think that's important.
Well, that's why I do the show is because I would like to read these books anyway, so then I have an excuse to hammer through it. Like, okay, so different topic on the negativity bias and optimism and all that stuff. I'm glad you discussed that in the book, because after I read that paper by Roy Baumeister, Why Bad is Stronger Than Good, and then the kind of the implications of, I was reading Tooby and Cosmides' paper on what is it? The second law of thermodynamics is the first law of natural of evolution, which is to push back against push up the gradient against the kind of entropy of nature, and natural selection is the only mechanism that pushes against that downward gradient. But then you start thinking about it, it's like, when bad things happen in your life and you feel like, why is this happening to me, and so on, and the answer appears to be there's no reason at all. That bad shit happening, that's the norm. This is what happens if you do nothing. So just get off your ass, Shermer, and get out there and do something about it. Otherwise, there's nobody doing anything. It's like, books on poverty. We don't need books on poverty. Poverty is what you get when you do nothing.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, that's Epictetus, the Stoics. He says it's not what happens, it's how you react that matters.
Right.
So, life is, everybody's going to have problems in their life. I mean, and we're all going to die. So, get over it and just start trying to live it as best you can.
Yeah. All right. What about marriage and relationships and things like that, and happiness?
It's a kind of mixed.
You have to be married.
Well, I am married, of course. It's a mixed bag. I kind of, I think it's back on the increase in the UK again. It went through a period where 50% ended in divorce. It's, I talk about the Tinder generation as well, that they don't work things through. They kind of swap partners quicker than they swap toothpaste. And I think that, I come from a time where you kind of had to put up with things. Yeah, you got on with it, but now I would imagine, I don't know is the answer to that. But I am surprised at the number of people who've met through technologies. And it strikes me that, it's all too easy to change partners if you're dissatisfied. And given the kind of individualism, which I think is rampant at the moment, where people are just wanting, immediate gratification and they don't want to work things through, it probably would be the case that, this is having an impact on relationships. I don't know is the answer, to be honest.
Well, there's something of a debate here in the United States that's become political about being married, staying married, and having kids in wedlock, not out of wedlock. Is the right recipe for raising healthy children, for economic stability. One of the leading predictors of poverty is having children out of wedlock or not getting married or having multiple spouses or whatever. But now that's become political. Oh, that's a conservative talking point. And, liberals are, we don't have to do that. You don't have to be married. Well, I wish we could leave the politics out and say, well, what works? What is it? What's your goal? And what's the strategy to get there?
Yeah. I mean, it does sound very conservative for what you suggest, but then sometimes there's some truth in this. I think
I know.
It's like a lot. I mean, a lot of the things that we call positive psychology today, you'll find in ancient texts. You'll find them in religious doctrines. You'll find them, the Good Samaritan, for example. These are all kind of wisdoms which have been passed down. So it's not, again, as if there's anything new here. But the world is different. I mean, there is this tendency to always assume that, I was writing a piece about the fact that we always denigrate the young and say, oh, they're just ungrateful, they're weak, they don't know how to. But we forget what we were like when we were young as well. We we have this sort of sense that we were much better. But I do think there's something going on which is related to this particular generation with the technology. Coming back to that point you raised right at the beginning there, and I think it's really causing problems because of this need to pursue individualistic, and this really amplifies social comparison. I think that's what's kind of at the core of why a lot of the kids are feeling so dissatisfied, because in a sense they're told that you've got to be an individual, you've got to have your own kind of agenda, your identities, and this is the trouble with everyone being an individual. It's just not conducive to having a good society. Diversity, inclusion, but they're kind of opposites of the same thing. I mean, you've got to kind of work out, a common ground. Because if everyone's behaving, you get the tragedy of the commons. Everyone just takes, and it doesn't really help.
Right. So then you get those individual cultures versus more collectivist cultures.
Yeah. That was an interesting.
Oh, yeah. Tight cultures, loose cultures, and all. We saw the differences during COVID, to what extent people were willing to go along with what the medical professionals recommended on masks and so on versus not.
Yeah. So we have a problem at the moment. We've got So this is a vaccination problem we're having at the moment, that we've fallen below the herd levels for measles. So we've got epidemics coming up. Well, we're not epidemics yet, but we're in danger of having the measles outbreaks again in this country because of people's sense of individualism. Like, I don't know about that. So you have to have a collective kind of approach to these things.
All right. How about religion and happiness? There's data showing that religious people are happier, they live longer, they're healthier, and so on. What do you make of that?
It's possible. Yeah. I think it's probably, I think there's something about structure in societies which, and they don't have to be religious. I'm not a great fan of religion, but I do understand why it can be so successful, because it provides a sense of identity and group. It brings people together. Yes, and it does promote all these aspects of human interaction, relationships, which seem to be associated with happiness. So yeah, I think religions, by their nature, are collectively kind of communal activities, and that would bolster, I think, a sense of purpose and a sense of meaning and a sense of belonging. But you don't have to be religious to do that. You can get that in other ways. I mean, I don't know if you heard about the third place. This is the kind of idea that, well, the third place concept is that if you think about our lives, we live them at work or we live them at home, or there used to be the third place, which is, it would have been the bowling alleys or the bars.
Bowling alone, right.
Yeah, that's right. So you almost need that third place, because you can't tell your partner or your spouse your problems, and you can't tell your workmates your problems, but you can kind of go to this third place and moan on about things there. But those third places are disappearing, or have been disappearing, and they're taken over by, again, the technology. People are spending their time, a lot of time, in this virtual third place, which is really toxic. It's kind of leading to a lot of disgruntlement. We're getting this polarization. Well, we don't need to go over the little territory again, but the traditional third places seem to be disappearing. Again, that's why I think things like religions probably offered that as a kind of sanctuary where you could kind of, moan on without having to worry about your spouse or your colleagues.
Yeah, that makes sense. Right, that makes sense. At least three places. Maybe, I don't know if you need more, but probably three is the right number.
Yeah,
okay, so how come Facebook didn't do that for this generation?
Well,
I mean, it was supposed to, right? This is going to bring us all together and have this other platform.
Look, again, I think, it's been, the social media has been the whipping boy for kind of all socials. I think it's unfairly been targeted, but there are aspects about it which are just not quite right, in my opinion. And I think that we're still working it through. We're still learning about, we've seen various platforms come and go. Who knows whether Twitter will survive? There's all sorts of, evolution. There's the constant change of these sorts of things. But I think, I mean, Facebook is kind of interesting, isn't it? Because actually the youngsters are not on it at all. It's us old fogies who are on it. So we're going to die off anyway. So Mark Zuckerberg has to keep thinking about how to reinvent it again. He bought Instagram. That's how he did it, which they are on. It would not surprise me to discover that it's gone in 15 years' time for whatever reason. You know, TikTok is this big thing at the moment, which really is a kind of ADHD of social media. You're just constantly flicking through things. So these are constantly evolving platforms. But there are some aspects about humans which do appear to be universal and unchanging. And that is, we want to be acknowledged, we want to be validated, we want to take part. We don't want to be ostracized, ignored, or denigrated. So there are some things which are constants, if you like, when it comes to human happiness.
Yeah, I mean, to people that are so anxious about this, they think the government should step in and start regulating the big tech companies. I don't know. You know, in 15 years, this all may be a completely different conversation. And
I think you're right there. I think, a friend of mine, Pete Etchells, has got a book out called Unlocked, and it's basically he's pushing against this whole thing about screen time. But yeah, we get people, we get these campaigns where people want to shut it down. I don't think you can. The genie's out of the bottle. I don't see how you can regulate it in that sense. I think there will always be ways around it. I mean,
what about parental controls? Just, you know, no apps on your phone until 15 or whatever.
I think that would probably, I mean, it really have to be across the board for it to work. I mean, the parents themselves are probably equally guilty of the amount of time they spend on these platforms. So,
I mean, this is what Jonathan Haidt wants, you know, that heavily regulated by the government and parents. But the problem, you have a collective action problem. If you're the only one at school that doesn't have the phone, you're screwed.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think I can't really see that working, to be honest. I mean, I think it could be, I mean, social phone etiquette, for example. When I had colleagues that would be in meetings, they'd be on their phones. There was nothing more irritating than, realizing that you were nowhere near as interesting or as important as their phone. But that's changed. I've seen that change in 5 years. So I think there are kind of mechanisms by social conventions which seem to be shaping even the phone use today. So I think I'm a bit more optimistic about it. But
bottom-up norm changes rather than top-down government regulations.
I think that's probably true, to be honest.
Yeah, I like that. It does change a lot. There's a funny meme of a picture on a subway where everybody's on their cell phone. And it's like, oh, remember the good old days when people didn't have cell phones? And then the other pictures, everybody's reading a newspaper on the subway. Oh, okay. Oh, and then there was another one the other day of the Titanic sinking. If it happened today, everybody would be in the water holding their cell phones up, filming the thing going down. Here I am. Look, it's going down. Yeah, that's just crazy. All right, while I have you, so let's talk about the self and free will determinism, two big popular issues here.
Oh, right. Okay.
I mean, if it's an illusion, say the self is an illusion, free will is an illusion, it's certainly a useful fiction.
Yeah, it is.
You kind of have to believe you're a self, or else how would you get out of bed and get out and function with people?
Yeah.
So I do wonder if ultimately there's some of these questions that are not answerable in some scientific way that, again, back to just kind of the first principles. That's one thought too many. I just feel free, so I'm going to assume I am. I know Sapolsky and Sam Harris, they have great arguments for determinism, and Dan Dennett has great arguments for compatibilism. These guys are all super smart, and they all have great arguments. Maybe it's not a solvable problem in some scientific way.
Yeah. I mean, I think my take on it is when I called it the self-illusion, I was really having a go. I wasn't saying there isn't a self. It's just not what it seems, okay? So it's a concept which captures a lot of what we're trying to explain, and that's really what a self is. It's a kind of, it's an entity that emerges out of a lot of unconscious parallel processing systems that gives you a kind of operating mode to track your activities and your behaviors, and by creating this sense of the self, it's much easier to document and take note of what seems to be the most important factors. The way I think about it, Michael, is I think about the self as a serial interface between the parallel world of the brain and everything going on there and the complexity of the external world. And that's what this conscious self is, this kind of a single actor. But it's an emergent property out of all of these sorts of things. Now, if that's the case, then you can argue for determinism, can't you? It's just that we haven't figured it out. There are just too many things to kind of measure. But ultimately, unless you, and this is the Sam Harris argument and others, that you don't choose the factors which actually play a role in your choices. Therefore, how could you ever have free will, because you're not responsible for that? So, and I think that's an argument you can't really dismiss. I mean, it's completely, but for me, when I talked about it, I was really trying to, get people to recognize that this thing we call the self clearly must be constructed, because we can see how it fractionates. We can perturb it. We can knock out a bit of it. We see it happens with Alzheimer's. We can see how people change, and that, whether it's disease, damage, or drugs, that identity can be fractionated in a way which is really a different person. So that's why I talk about it as being a constructed thing. But that's not the way we think about it, because we are the self. That we can't step out of ourselves and see ourselves objectively, because we are that. I think there's a diagram in the book where I've got Escher's hands, one drawing the other, and it's that kind of relationship that I'm trying to capture in this kind of book. But these are fiddly and irritatingly annoying concepts, but you're absolutely right. If you didn't have or operate with the belief in the self or belief in free will, then you'd have a really weird and dysfunctional society. Even if there isn't free will, we've got to behave as, I think I'm paraphrasing someone else, Isaac Singer, I think it is, but we have to believe in free will. It's like there is no choice. And so you wouldn't want to, for example, you wouldn't want to abandon your legal systems just because someone says, oh, it's deterministic. The fact that there is a system which blames people for their behavior is in itself a factor which shapes behavior. So that's why, we shouldn't immediately just sort of say, oh, well, they're not responsible.
Robert Sapolsky makes the argument that in the Middle Ages, they blame the axe, and not just the guy who swung the axe to kill the person. The axe got punished. And of course, that's ridiculous. So he says, it's the equivalent today of blaming somebody for their neural networks or whatever. They didn't choose any of that. The neurons are like the axe. They're just physical mechanisms just doing their thing over which you have no control. So then the question becomes, well, do you have some self-control? Because I think you do, because you're aware of your past. So I use Heraclitus as you can't step into the same river twice. The river's not the same, and you're not the same. So this question, could you have done otherwise in the rewind of the tape? So here's how I think about that. This was Gould's original thought experiment, rewind the tape back to the start of life and play it again. And Dennett points out, well, if it's a read-only memory tape, then yes, it would happen exactly the way it did, because it's just a recording. You're just playing it back to see what happened. But that's not really what he meant, and what we mean by saying, could you have done differently? If the circumstances are exactly the same and you're exactly the same, then no, you don't have a choice. But that's not the universe we live in. We live in a universe with an arrow of time, and the future is never exactly the same as the past, and you're not ever exactly the same, and you can learn from what happened before. And, I remember being in a situation like this, and last time I did this, so this time I'm going to do this other thing. Well, who's making that decision? Well, you are. Well, now maybe that's something of an illusion, but who else would be making the decision? That's how I think about that.
Okay. All right.
I mean, it's still a determined universe, but you're part of the causal net of the determined universe. Yeah. And therefore, you can kind of reshape how the future goes. Unless we live in a block universe it's all happened already, and the observer could just peek ahead to see what the outcome was before you know it. But I don't think we live in that universe. Some physicists think we do, but most don't, I think.
Yeah.
Anyway. I mean, all of this depends very much on, I think, a lot of your attitudes towards social justice. I mean, Robert begins his book with the graduation ceremony at Stanford University. He's sitting there, and everybody's so proud of themselves, and the parents and grandparents and so on, and they're all patting themselves on the back. Our little one did so good, and so on. And he sees in the distance the gardener who's picking up weeds and trash, and it's like, how come that guy didn't go to Stanford? What was different about him versus that kid right there that grew up in this privileged home or whatever? And then it goes all the way back to, his teenage years and his childhood and in the womb, and maybe his mother had this in the second trimester, had this, hormone burst or whatever. He has no control over any of this. So you kind of see where he's going with that. It's not really fair for these Stanford grads to take credit for something, and the gardener guy, well, too bad you just didn't work hard enough. That's not fair either. So you see the way it spins out there very much depends on other things, like how you think about social justice and politics.
I mean, that's actually a bit of that's a kind of common fallacy, isn't it? The attributional error, that we kind of blame people for their misfortune because we wouldn't like to think that it's like a just worldview. We think that bad things, we need to believe that there's causal mechanisms which get people into Stanford, and people are responsible for their problems, because otherwise the alternative is that this could happen to any of us, which is what you're saying. And people don't like that. Yeah,
right. Another one of those Seinfeld riffs where, you get on the plane and you have to walk through the first class to get back to coach. And then you sit down and they close the curtain and they give you that look like, I'm sorry, you didn't work harder. Yeah. Wasn't that Dagner Keltner did that research on the this was in Berkeley, where the model of the car, you step out into the crosswalk, does the car stop or not? And the more expensive the car, the least likely they were to slow down and stop.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I don't know if it's Dagner who did that, but it wouldn't surprise me if he did. He's incredibly productive. I've never met him, but I've read a lot of his work, and I think he's done some really cool stuff on awe, which is what he's working on.
Yes, he was on the show for awe. Yeah, I like that. It's very much tied into everything you write about in this book, because mostly what you're talking about is how do you get to that awe is just this kind of state of gratitude and appreciation, and I think it's one of your 7 of just kind of getting out of yourself. He talks about just daily awe, just like go for a walk outside for 20 minutes, just down some little path or so. You don't have to be at the beach or whatever, although that's cool, but just something to get out of the building, out of your head. And that's all you got to do. And the findings, and it's not just his work. I mean, there's a bunch of people converging on this idea that, the default mode network is this network in the brain which becomes activated when you're kind of worried, when you're not doing things, when you're not task focused. This is what the brain does, and it's associated with unhappiness. And part of the reason is the default mode network is the representation of self and others. And I make the point that probably what's going on is you're kind of just thinking, God, I've got so many things going on in my life which are not working out. But when you go for a walk in nature, or you have these awe experiences, this default mode is actually attenuated. Same in meditation as well. So I think a lot of it comes back to the general theme I've been talking about, that part of our problem is we're so egocentric that if you kind of broaden your view, your perspective, and start to become more other focused or allocentric, then you're going to be a happier person. And I think awe does that. It doesn't involve other people necessarily, but it really gets you in relative size to the rest of the world. And in fact, he had a paper out last year, I think maybe you talked about it on your show, but people take photographs of themselves that if they're taking an urban walk, they're kind of big and center in the picture but if they're outside, they tend to have themselves smaller relative to everything else. No, I didn't know that. No.
Yeah, it's a very cool finding. Yeah, so it's just you start to see, your position relative to things. And I think that's a much more balanced way of seeing it.
Well, I do, as atheists, I think it's good to give credit to religion, who I think figured a lot of things out just by, chance or just, trial and error. That, human nature, we have the inner demons and better angels. So let's have everybody meet once a week, and we're going to remind you, these are the good things to do. These are the bad things you want to avoid, because you got to re-up it fairly constantly. And, when you go to these medieval cathedrals, like I like to do, the one in Cologne where my wife is from, the big dome there, oh my God, it's just so inspiring.
They're awesome.
It's just astonishing how you really feel differently in there. And, they kind of figured that out. Let's get people out of their this third place, right? Just out of your head, out of your family, out of your work. And there's this special place. And once a week, we're going to do all this.
Yeah. And you combine it with a bit of singing and a bit of chanting and a bit of movement and synchronicity. And my God, you suddenly feel there's some transcendent thing going on. It's moving because it taps into exactly the sorts of things that we've been talking about.
Well, maybe for your next book on essentialism, why is it that the mind feels differently to people than, say, your digestion? So here's the example. Somebody the other day asked, well, what happens to you? What happens when you die? It's like, well, what happens to your digestion when your body dies? Like, what? Where does it go? Where does your heartbeat go when your heart stops beating? It's like, well, it doesn't go anywhere. Right.
What is it? I was going to say, what
so
a strange question.
See,
I see.
The analogy is the mind is just a word we use to describe what the brain is doing. It's a process.
Yeah.
So you think of, like the old view of life is an elan vital. There's this thing that's floating around in there that's alive, that makes it all alive. And then, where does it go? And when the body dies, we've reified it into this thing. So here's my kind of monistic materialist view of the mind. It's just a word that we're using to describe what the brain is doing. And so, but the essentialism, I think we're natural born essentialists and dualists, like you said, is that, it feels like when I die, my brain will just float off the network and into the quantum ether or whatever, wherever it goes, or heaven or something like that. But to me, as a materialist, I don't think it goes anywhere. I don't know. How do you think about all that?
Oh, I totally agree. I mean, it's kind of interesting. For developmentally, of course, this is exactly what children think. They can't conceive of non-existence.
Right.
And we never really abandon these kind of notions. I mean, that was SuperSense's thesis, that a lot of the adult, beliefs are actually, their origins are just the natural way of thinking as children. And we never abandon them. Like the egocentrism, for example. I probably should have said more about this in the book, but if you put people under stress, they become more egocentric. They revert back to their childhood way of seeing things. And actually, that's true, because if you think about it, when you become narrow, your attentional focus becomes very self-preservation, me. When there's a crisis arising. So I think, the idea that continuing to exist, that's one of the, and that's why we use euphemisms of passing over and gone. It's like as if they've gone somewhere. Like they're not here, but they've gone, they're existing, but not in this place, as it were. And I think that's what you're describing. That's the natural inclination.
But even the hard problem of consciousness, it just, you talked to materialist neuroscientists, but there's something special and different about consciousness than any other bodily function. Yeah. And I don't know if it's just an intuitive thing. It just feels like my thoughts are floating around up there. But of course, without the neurons, there's nothing going on.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, well, we agree on that.
Yeah.